Hello everyone and welcome to the Omega Metroid podcast. My name is Andy Spiteri, joined, as always, by my two pals, Dakota Lasky, Doom Crossing. Dak, how you doing today, dude?
I'm doing alright, man. Hanging in there. Ready to talk some more Metroid. Getting close to episode 100, which is pretty hype. And yeah, we're in 2022. I don't have much going on. I'm chilling. How about you?
Well, I got my Omega booster earlier this week, and I felt like a speed boost block that Samus had just shine sparked right through. I felt so bad for like a day and a half, but I'm on the mend. I'm feeling fine. I'm happy to be here, and yeah, you know, it's a pretty good day, all things considered. How about you, Mr. Crossing? How are you feeling today?
Pretty good. I feel like I'm the only person that hasn't gotten any side effects of my booster. Deadass felt nothing. Absolutely nothing
Really?
when I got mine. Yeah, not even like a headache or cold sweats or anything. So, I don't know. I'm one of the lucky few, I guess. But yeah, it's been a chill day. Went to the gym, got a nice shower, and now gonna talk about some Metroid with the boys.
Nice. Yeah, I did. I felt pretty bad on, I guess Friday. I was about to say yesterday, but today's Sunday. So Friday I felt pretty bad, but I like just basically sat like a blob on my couch, not feeling good. So I decided to just play Metroid Dread. So I had a nice little run of Metroid Dread and had a good time with that. So, you know, even when I wasn't feeling all that great, I still got some Metroid in. So it was nice. But yeah, we're gearing up to finish off what we didn't get to last week, which is of course talking about what Metroid Dread might have looked like if it had released on the Nintendo DS as originally planned, and also what the series might have looked like if that happened. But before we get there, Dak teed us up earlier, and man, we are 5 weeks away from episode number 100 of the Omega Metroid podcast, and we have a ton of cool stuff planned for episode 100, and one of them, for the actual episode, we are going to be revealing what we are going to be doing next week. So tune in next week. It's going to be a super show. I'll tell you that. We're going to be streaming it. It's going to be live. You can have the details, next week once we hammer them out and figure it out. But it's going to involve, of course, myself. It's going to involve Dak. It's going to involve Doom, and we'll have a few other. I'll have a few other surprises along the way too. I've already done my part, actually. I've thought of the content, as I mentioned to you guys earlier, so I'm ready to go, and I'm really excited to see if you guys can hang with what I already jotted down.
Yo, are we revealing a new Smash character?
Well, I the intention is to smash characters in episode number 100 in a kind of way, but I don't want to give too much away, but I'm really excited for this. I've thought of some good stuff, and I am like chomping at the bit to see how you guys react to what I have for you. So it's gonna be a lot of fun.
We're gonna have an Omega Metroid Direct. It's gonna be an hour of just new reveals for the show.
You know what? It's really funny that you say that, because I was gonna reveal it later. But we legitimately are going to have an Omega Metroid Direct sometime around the time of episode number 100. And I'm not joking. I'm legitimately going to do that. It's not going to be an hour, but there's going to be a lot of stuff that we have coming down the pipe. And what better way to get that all out than with an Omega Metroid Direct? So you jest, but I'm serious. That's going to happen. So we'll talk about that more in the future too. But next week, we are pulling the curtain back on what we're doing for episode number 100, and I am really looking forward to that. I think it's going to be one of the funner things that we do. So
The Omega Metroid Direct is just a montage of Kirby gameplay.
Oh god.
Yeah, this is becoming a Kirby podcast after episode 100. That's the big reveal. I'm sorry. I just just spoiled it for everybody, but I know Andy's been really passionate about it for so long, so I think it's the right direction.
You'd have to get me in, like, you'd have to film an epic death scene for me in order for that to ever happen. Like, I'm fighting hordes and hordes of Kirby's, and they just finally take me out, like Boromir. I don't know.
We're also renaming it the Metroid Prime is an FPS podcast as well.
the new Metroid Prime podcast, the Metroid Prime Returns podcast. All right, let's let's talk about Metroid Dread here. And so I just ran this game the other day. Fantastic game. Creeping up there actually is maybe it's my second favorite 2D Metroid now. If not, then it's getting up there, and I think with subsequent playthroughs, it's going to probably get to that benchmark eventually. But one of the things that we were going to talk about last week that we didn't have time for is what if this game would have released on the Nintendo DS as originally intended. So I'm really looking forward to this kind of thought experiment because I went a little bit in depth here and kind of broke it down on what could have translated, what couldn't have translated, things that maybe would have had to change, things that could have been the same. So I'm gonna take you guys on a journey through some thoughts that I had, and of course you guys let me know what you think as well. But just from a very basic, from the very basic premise, I feel like we've heard series producer Sakamoto talk about like that the technology held back Metroid Dread from coming on the Nintendo DS. And the more I think about it, and obviously none of us are game developers, so what do we know? But the more I think about it, the more I truly think that you could have made this game on DS with some compromises. But I really do think that the technology wasn't as perhaps far removed from making this game plausible on the Nintendo DS as maybe we've been led to believe. I'd like to hear your guys' thoughts on that before I kind of give you my list of stuff that I thought up.
I mean, it's really hard to tell because we as outsiders, it's not even necessarily a game development perspective. It's just because we as outsiders, we don't know any specifics beyond, it was difficult to make because of the technology. We don't know what specific parts of it was difficult to make. Obviously, the biggest assumption, and I think this one's a fairly educated guess, is probably the EMMI's AI. That's yes. Kind of like the big one that we're talking about. And I feel like to a degree that was absolutely not possible back then, because even games more recently like Alien Isolation and stuff like that, that's stuff that we haven't even seen until like the last, I want to say 4 or 5 years ago, let alone like way back in the DS era. So I think something like that's fair, but beyond that, it's really hard to make a judgment on that.
Yeah, I think that's the sticking point as well, is probably the EMMIs. But yeah, I don't know, Dak, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, we're thinking how many years this game might have come out after Fusion. Would have been enough to just like have the EMMIs kind of be more scripted again, and maybe just do it in a larger kind of like to a larger degree, like a bigger scale, rather than just like the smaller encounters we had with the SAX and Fusion. I'm not sure if that's a compromise they're probably willing to make, because when I'm thinking back to a lot of like the games that had like gameplay going across both screens on the DS, a lot of games had this, and they kind of like dealt with the blind spot in between. Even when you had like those bigger areas, you didn't have like these really active, aggressive enemies going from one screen to the other. Like I think of like Yoshi's Island DS, where like they had the other like the map was just bigger. You could see more of the screen, but you're really just shooting at eggs. It's not like you're running away from like this crazy monster or whatever it is the entire time. So I feel like they might have, if they were going to do it, they could have done it across both screens, but they probably would have had to have sacrificed a lot of that aggressiveness and AI that that Doom brings up, as opposed to having a more like scripted enemy that we saw like in Fusion.
Right. Well, I guess we might as well just start there, because I have a whole section on the EMMIs, and when I said that you could make this game on the DS with a few sacrifices, I think that the EMMIs are the sacrifice that you would have had to make, because I think that is exactly probably, making, like Doom said, an educated guess. That is the piece of technology that was holding back Metroid Dread from happening on the Nintendo DS. So I think that you could have still included the EMMIs, because it wasn't necessarily like like you'd had portable games that had stealth segments before. Like I'm thinking like Metal Gear for the Game Boy Color, and even some Zelda games have like little stealth segments inside of them. Even Metroid Fusion to an extent is there's times where you have to sneak around the SAX, and you could program those enemies in a way where they have kind of a limited range of sight, but it is in a very scripted manner and a very like closed kind of sequence. So that I think is what would have been the biggest sacrifice to Metroid Dread. There is another one, but I'll get to that later. I think that you could have still had the basic premise with the EMMIs and included the EMMIs in scripted movements and a routine that they would have had, and then it would have been up to the players to avoid the routine. And maybe you just change the level design so that instead of the EMMIs coming from kind of any direction and having the intelligence to react to any sounds or anything like that, maybe the level design is just a little bit tighter and a little bit more constricted so that it's just harder to avoid the EMMIs, even though they're going on these predetermined paths. Because I think that if you had the EMMIs on these predetermined paths and the level layout is kind of what it is now, which is very large open rooms for the most part, it would be pretty easy to just blitz by them pretty quickly once you kind of learn their movements and their patterns. So I think that's one of the biggest things about Metroid Dread is that like they don't necessarily have set patterns. There's a lot of like RNG associated with the EMMI's movements and stuff like that, which makes it kind of a keep you on your toes kind of gameplay. So I think that they could have overcame that by having scripted segments with EMMIs in the same patterns that they would keep on doing over and over. I do wonder if that, I mean, it obviously wouldn't have been the same. And I do wonder if having like 6 EMMI encounters where you need to sneak through these different obstacles essentially to avoid them, and as many times as you do in each area, would have definitely gotten old after a while. But I think it could have been possible. Not necessarily, I don't know if it would have been great, but I think it could have been possible.
Possible, yes, but I don't think it would have been optimal just because of that more linear structure where it's on a predetermined path. I feel like it would have been way too similar to the SAX. It wouldn't have been able to differentiate itself enough. Whereas the EMMI now in Metroid Dread as it currently is, it's clearly inspired by SAX. Sakamoto has even stated that in a couple of the interviews, as well as the diary that came out right after the E3 Direct. But there's still enough there to where it's able to differentiate itself and feel like a completely new challenge, despite the clear similarities and comparisons and inspirations.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that I think, like I said, it would have been possible. I don't know if it would have been ideal, because I do think that it would have been a little bit of diminishing returns, because like the EMMI is the big hook of Metroid Dread.
Yeah.
And I don't know that it could have been the big hook of Metroid Dread on the DS. I think it could have been a feature to include, like maybe you have to. I guess what I'm saying is I think you're right. Like it would have been more so like avoiding the SAX, but on a more personal, up close scale. And I think that would have gotten a little bit old after a while, because I could have seen SAX encounters that were kind of based like EMMI encounters that were kind of based off the SAX encounter in like Sector 2 when you have to freeze it and keep running and hit the switches and stuff like that. But like that kind of really only works because there's so few and far between in the game, and they're pulsating when they happen. But yeah, I don't know that they could have built an entire game based around that then. Well, I think they could have, but I just don't know if it would have been fantastic.
I don't know.
But,
I feel like
yeah.
you guys are underselling it a little bit, because at the same, well, I think the amount of the encounters we got in like in Fusion against the SAX was good. I would have liked more, and I would have loved more like sequences like that in the game. So if they had made another 2D Metroid with just more of the SAX, I really don't think it would have been like I don't think it would have gotten as stale as you guys are kind of making it seem, because I just feel like the SAX was already pretty well balanced in the Fusion to begin with. That said, I think another thing we're also missing here is that we'd also miss those like kind of quick time experiences as you try to counter the the EMMIs in Dread, which I don't think you would have been able to pull off like really effectively on the DS back then either, like just how cinematic it is and being able to include those kind of quick times and and make it like as I guess scary or intense as it is now on the Switch, right? Like you kind of do it back then, I don't think it would have the same kind of effect. And I think tonally with where the Switch is now, you can also pull off a lot more things that make the EMMI a lot scarier and a lot more intimidating as an opponent, as an enemy, as opposed to what was possible on the DS.
I think going off that as well, and this kind of branches out from just specifically the EMMI, but another thing that we would have to consider is that this would have been internally developed entirely by Nintendo. Probably not any third-party help, so no Mercury Steam, no Team Ninja, no Next Level Games, nothing. And yeah, so there'd be no outside support, and so I don't think you would have as much of an emphasis on combat, including that counter mechanic, and even stuff like the flash shift, which while it's technically a movement ability,
we'll get there. We'll get there.
Yeah, heavily utilized in combat. And I think you'd be losing a lot of all of that development insider.
You don't think the flash shift would be? See, I think the flash shift is one of the few things that would work.
We'll get there. We'll talk about items in a second.
Right.
Let's keep it on track with the EMMIs here. And actually, I want to talk about the gameplay even before we get to the items. But so my general takeaway here, and I think that we're kind of all in agreement, is that you could have done the EMMIs in Metroid Dread if it was on the DS in let's say 2006 or even 2008 or 9 or whatever it was supposed to be. But in order to do that, they would have had to have been scripted segments, and they would have been a lot more similar to the SAX encounters in Metroid Dread. Is that fair to say?
In Metroid Fusion, yeah.
In Metroid Fusion, I'm sorry.
Yes.
I wonder how many times I'm gonna convince the SAX and EMMIs and Metroid Dread.
I think I already have. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's keep it counter. So I mean, let's talk about gameplay for a second here, because I think that you could obviously base a lot of the gameplay on what was already done in Zero Mission and Fusion. With some of the new mechanics that were included in Dread, though, I don't know. I think it would have been hit or miss. Because one of the, as silly as it sounds, one of the biggest things that they included in Metroid Dread was the slide, and they delayed you getting the Morph Ball. And I think that you could have very easily included that into the 2D game, even if it was on the DS back in 2006. Castlevania had a series of DS games, and functionally they were very similar to the Metroid games, 2D Metroid games, and those ones had slides in them, and they worked pretty well. So I don't think that would have been a problem. But as Doom mentioned, I think where you would have been struggling a bit and missing a lot of that satisfaction is in kind of the counters and melee combat and stuff like that, because I don't know that there is a way to. I mean, I guess they could have put that counter in and it could have worked. I don't know if that would have been as smooth or silky on the DS. I had an idea for something that I could have actually seen happening, which would have been horrible, but I don't know. Do you guys think it would have been realistic to have counters like that in QuickTime events like that available on the Nintendo DS at that time?
Well, here's the thing. Theoretically, they could have, certainly, but I'm just not sure if that internally developed team at Nintendo would have thought of that idea. Because for those who don't know, the counter mechanic, which was introduced in Samus Returns, it's actually based off of the Lords of Shadow Mirrors of Fate game, which Mercury Steam also developed before they got hired to do the Samus Returns remake. And there's actually a lot of stuff in Samus Returns that's heavily influenced from that Mirror of Fate game as well. There's a really cool video on it that just came out that I posted on the Discord actually, that goes into the Mercury Steam's all history and their passion for 2D Metroidvanias, but that's neither here nor there. The point is, basically what I'm trying to say, TLDR, while theoretically the internal team at Nintendo could have thought up that and found a way to implement that on the DS, I'm not sure if they would have, because those are, they're different people with individual unique thoughts. They have different game philosophies and stuff like that compared to Mercury Steam, based, continents away. As well as decades in advancement in research, technology, and the evolution of the Metroidvania formula, which was also making a comeback at that point in time.
Yeah, I totally see what you're saying. I guess what I'm saying is if someone in the room at Nintendo in 2005 or 6 was I have this great idea, we're going to introduce melee counters. I don't even know that they could have done that as on the DS. Maybe they could have, but I don't know if it would have been as I don't know what that would have looked like. I can't think of any comparables on the DS that had a similar mechanic like that at that time. So I don't know if that could have even been possible, even if they did have the idea, which to your point, they probably wouldn't have.
I
Because
mean,
that certainly wouldn't have been something in Metroid at that point.
I agree to that extent, but also at the same time, it still wouldn't be that crazy to implement, right? Like, it's just a simple input. Like, it's just like a button press. So, like, it's not that wild to think someone might have thought of, like, a melee. Like, especially in Air Dash, too. Like, that's something that was in, like, Mega Man as well, from what I remember. So, like, it wasn't even like that was, like, as you said, slides were in Castlevania. Like, I don't think those kinds of mechanics were necessarily out of the realm of possibility. It was more so, like, what they were willing to do. And I think like if it also really depends on whether or not the game would have been like a 3D kind of game on like a 2D plane, like Samus Returns or Dread, would have been like an actual 2D game like those Castlevania games. So I think that also is a factor. I think it would. I think that's the definitely would have been like same with like the QuickTime events. That's definitely doable. It's just implementing it like a button press essentially encounter. If anything, that's probably one of the I don't know, game development wise, like not the hardest thing to implement, right? Like a quick time or like a quick like reaction button press. But would it have had like the same kind of effect? Like would it have been as satisfying? Like would they have had like been able to capture that kind of speed that the newer games have? Because Samus Returns and even like Dread are a lot faster than those older 2D Metroids. And I'm not sure if like were they willing to go like and make the game faster even if it was 2D or not. I think that's definitely doable. I think they could, if anything, the dash and the counter, I think, are probably the more doable and likely things that would have made its way, like, that would have been possible back then and maybe doable back then. They would have been willing to do back then, as opposed to, like, implementing the EMMI outright.
So in terms of speed, I actually kind of disagree with you there because like Samus Returns is actually like one of the slowest 2D Metroid. Like it's even slower than Metroid Fusion. I think the only games, at least 2D wise, that are slower in comparison is the original Metroid 2 and of course NES Troid. But otherwise all the other games like run faster. They run at 60 FPS. Samus's movement speed is faster. I think sometimes Samus Returns can feel a little faster just because the enemies are more aggressive, so you're doing a little more at once. Whereas they kind of sit more idly by in some of the previous entries. But like otherwise, in terms of like the actual movement and stuff, I don't think that would have been an issue implementing on the DS.
I don't know. I don't. Maybe I'm just thinking that like the actual, because I mean you're right. It would have been simple enough to put a counter mechanic in. It's just a button. I guess what I'm saying is it wouldn't have felt. Obviously, it wouldn't have felt the same. It wouldn't have been that fluid movement of Samus like spinning around and like giving a drop kick to someone and just exploding and stuff like that. And I think that uh, I'm skipping ahead a little bit here, but I guess whatever. We'll just talk about it now. I think the boss battles probably would have taken a big hit if they were on the DS specifically for this reason. The boss battles are like super cinematic. One of the best things about Metroid Dread, I think we can all agree. And well, I think that you could probably replicate pretty much every single boss that is in the game. They wouldn't be as cinematic, which is such an important part of the presentation of Metroid Dread. And I guess I'm thinking back to the way that Metroid Fusion and Super Metroid introduces their bosses, and those aren't cinematic necessarily either, but they still feel like awesome encounters. So I'm sure that they could have found a way to make it work, but yeah, I don't know. I'm trying to think of how the Ravenbeak fight would have been presented in a 2D fashion, and it's hard to wrap your head around, you know.
Yeah, I feel like the bosses would have at least been good or decent in like a DS game, but obviously they wouldn't have even come close to Dread. Because I mean, we've talked about it multiple times now, but Dread's boss fights are like some of the best in the series, and I've talked about it before. Ravenbeak is in my top three. Experiment is in my top five somewhere. Like just absolutely incredible jaw-dropping fights that sometimes it's hard to believe that you're actually still in control. Even when you're not doing the melee counter cutscene, it's just incredible to see like all the cool tech that you're doing and all the damage that you're dishing out on these giant hulking monstrosities. And there's no way that you could replicate something like that on the DS.
I think it definitely is on like a boss to boss basis. Like real quick, like SQ for example, I think would probably translate fine to like the older like something on the something on the DS or something like that, because it's a pretty simple boss. Ends up turning into a Core X, so that works out really well. Whereas you have like the Kraid boss fight, which without its kind of cinematic additions from Dread, is pretty much like any other Kraid boss fight. Like, it's nothing too
Hmm.
crazy different. So, like, it being doable nowadays is a lot more significant for that boss fight. Whereas, like, some of the other smaller bosses, and I would even say, like, some of the earlier bosses in the game, aside from Kraid, are still would probably be doable in the S without too much of a translation. But I agree, like, Ravenbeak, that's his name, Ravenbeak. He would definitely be the one where, yeah, you wouldn't have this, it wouldn't have the same effect, I don't think, if they did like the double wing effect or the double wing reveal on the DS. I guess maybe it
The
wouldn't.
one-winged angel. Come on.
Yeah, well, it's a double winged angel. It's 2-winged angel now. But like, but at the same time, like, I'm thinking it would be maybe similar to like the zero mission cutscenes, like those really short ones. But those are still like static images, with, like, a little bit of dynamic movement, and not at all the same as like a fully animated 3D kind of movie cutscene. So again, it does definitely come back to those like cinematic effects, because again, yeah, like, you could definitely implement like the EMMIs quick time, like, kill or be killed kind of scenario when you get caught on the DS, but would it have the same kind of scary effect dying over and over again, or at least the first few times on the DS, when you probably wouldn't be able to have like those same 3D animations and effects as you could on the Switch now? So a lot of it might just come in, like, what might be coming into play here is like their vision for what was possible, like, visually, right? Aside from just gameplay.
Yeah. And I agree with you. I think that almost all of the fights could have been translated. I think that you might have struggled, obviously, with Ravenbeak. I think that Corpius, you might have struggled with the parts that he's invisible. But obviously you'd have to get rid of like the big cinematics in the experiment fight. But I think for the most part that would have been, like I said, you could have done it, but with sacrifices. But I think that one of the areas where if you were to have made this game, that you would have had to take a huge sacrifice on, probably even more significant than sacrificing the AI of the EMMIs, is the actual world and layout of the map. Because if this would have been a Nintendo DS game, I would bet everything that would have been based on a classic grid, in the same way that Super was, in the same way that Fusion was, the same way that Zero Mission was, even in the same way that the Castlevania games on the DS were. So, I think that one of the strengths, at least for me, for Metroid Dread, as a fan of 2D Metroid, is the way that its rooms are like these unique shapes, and the way that they use the map to kind of, there's not just like these weird random recharge stations. They're part of the integrated map. It's a really unique layout that they have for all the areas. Like, I'm thinking like the giant tree room in Gavrin is like such a standout spot in the Metroid Dread map to me, or like just how massive those EMMI rooms truly are. A lot of that I think would have had to been severely scaled back, and scaling back is fine, but I feel like it might have been, I don't know, it might have been ready to move past the grid-based system in 2006, and clearly it wouldn't have if it would have released back then. So I think that might have actually been the single biggest compromise that it would have had to make. And I don't know if you guys feel strongly about that as I do, but looking back, knowing that what we got in Metroid Dread was so spectacular in terms of areas and stuff like that, I feel like that would have been pretty hard for me to imagine.
Yeah, I never even considered that before, but yeah, I don't know. I don't know if it would necessarily be the biggest compromise, but yeah, that would definitely completely change the feel of the game. And even Samus Returns, which was on the 3DS, more powerful than the DS, that still used a grid-based layout as well. So you would certainly not be seeing that on a Nintendo DS game for sure.
Yeah, I wonder if maybe it would feel too much like Fusion then, because it would have to cut down a lot, and you wouldn't get maybe some of the more distinctive areas, or maybe you wouldn't get some of like the more changing dynamic stuff. Like, I'm not sure exactly where they would have cut there, and there's a lot of like slight differences from Dread in terms of like environment diversity that I hope would stay like towards the latter parts of the game. Are we good on talking about spoilers? I feel like we can.
Oh
Yeah,
we can talk about
so
spoilers.
like, the later Chozo areas I would hope would have to stay there. But then, like, you have a lot of pretty, like, this is the hot area, and this is the water area, and this is the starting kind of area. Like, I wonder if like what exactly would kind of get trimmed. I would really hope we don't lose like the first area where you run into Raven Beak and you have like the cool like cherry blossom trees and the Chozo statues. But I would say overall maybe the areas would just all feel smaller. Maybe the EMMI rooms wouldn't feel like they would take up so much of their particular area. Like I could see like I'm not entirely like what do you think? Like how do you think they would trim it down?
Well, I mean, obviously it would just be a smaller map, just due
Yeah.
to the hardware that it would have been on. But I like for me, and I wasn't sure that you guys would think this was a big deal or not. But for me, like just being a 2D Metroid, I love me a 2D Metroidvania game. Um, the layout of the map is just like, and the layout of the rooms and how they're just not boxed into these like grids is a real strength of Metroid Dread for me. Samus Returns kind of does it a little bit, but in the end, it is a grid based game. Whereas just I don't know, it adds a sense of like realism to me that not all these rooms are just like perfect squares and
Yeah.
um that there are things that are integrated a little bit more. Like yes, you have dedicated save stations and yes, you have atom rooms and stuff like that. But to me, it just feels a little bit I don't know smoother than having just everything on kind of like your 2x2 grid system. So and I think that would have I'm sure that they would have made the areas still feel distinct. Like you would have had your water, your fire, your forest area. But I feel like the way that the map is structured is a really big selling point of Metroid Dread for me. And I've never heard anyone else talk about the way that the room is structured as one of the things that they like about Metroid Dread. But it is for me. So yeah, I hope I explained that. Um, let's talk about the items because I think that in terms of items, I was trying to think, and I really only think that there's two items that wouldn't have worked at the time in Metroid Dread if it was a DS game. So we know obviously that the space jump, the screw attack, the speed boost, the morph ball, ice missiles, grapple beam. We know all that stuff works in a 2D setting. The spider magnet is literally just crawling on monkey bars from Metroid Fusion, so we know that that works. I think the cross bombs would have worked just fine in that setting. Obviously, all the beams were already a thing back then, so those would have worked. Um, I was thinking about the flash shift, like you were mentioning earlier, and I wasn't entirely sure if that would have translated over or not. And originally, I said I don't think it would, but I don't think it's that big of a deal because I was thinking of some other DS games at the time, and I keep on going back to Castlevania, but I do that because I feel like it's the obvious comparison. And they do have a dash mechanic in that game, and I don't think it would have been a big deal to have that dash mechanic just work even if you're in air. So that one actually I do think would have been possible to include in this game, but I think that where you would have had to cut items is in the Phantom Cloak. I don't know that that could have made it into the game as originally intended. Like I don't know that the technology was there to turn Samus invisible, and I don't know that the storm missile would have made its way in either because I don't know how they would have done that if maybe they could have, and maybe I'm just not being imaginative enough, but I feel like that's a lot of missiles and a lot of locking on for like the DS at the time. But those are the two items that I think might have been on the chopping block if this had originally released on the DS.
See, I again because I'm trying to think of how the Dread or gameplay would have been on the DS if it would have been like gameplay across two screens or would have been like gameplay on one screen and maybe a map on the bottom, whatever. Because I'm thinking like the storm missile would be really cool on like two screens. You're shooting from the bottom screen and you hit all the way up onto the top to hit something. I think that could have worked. I mostly agree with the Phantom Cloak. Just in terms of legibility, I don't know if they would have been confident enough to make Samus like go completely invisible. Maybe they would have had it so she's not like entirely invisible. But the storm missiles I could have seen working pretty well, like and having that kind of lock on. You kind of look around a little bit. Or maybe because it's on the DS, you use like the touch screen, use like the stylus to go around and touch stuff. I see. I could see that happening because I'm thinking in my head like there's absolutely a chance a game like this would have touch controls for stuff.
Well, I want to get there
So,
actually just in a quick second.
because of
So,
that, I think, when we're thinking back to DS games, they would, try to incorporate a lot of mechanics and abilities so that way you'd be forced to kind of use the touchscreen or you'd be
Yeah.
encouraged to. So in this kind of case, I'm like, oh yeah, an ability where you got to have multiple targets, 100% can see tapping on each individual target with my stylus on the bottom screen or whatever it is, or somehow like shooting at all of them from the bottom screen to the top screen. And so I think that 100% would stay in the game. The Phantom Cloak maybe
do you
not.
remember earlier when I said I had an idea, but it sucked? Do you want to know what that idea was?
What I just said?
That it was basically what you just laid out. Yeah.
But I'm not saying it'd be a good idea. I'm just saying I 100% see that happening. Like
I don't disagree.
I actually low key think it's a good idea.
Okay, before we talk about touchscreen, Doom, what do you think? What are all the items that are in Dread able to be in Dread if it's a DS game, or are any of these on the chopping block for you?
No, I pretty much agree with everything you said. I don't have much else commentary to add. Just that, kind of like Dak was saying earlier, I don't think the flash shift would be theoretically hard to implement at all. I mean, it's a staple in the Mega Man Zero series, for example, and that was back on the SNES. So implementing that I don't think would be hard. It's more just a matter of, I don't think Nintendo's internal teams would have thought to implement that. I think that was something we got more from the Mercury Steam side of the development process.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't really see Samus as like a character be like that kind of, I don't know, character to do, I guess, like have such a like an offensive and like fast move. Other than like, I guess the speed booster is, I guess, the exception, but I don't know, the flash shift and like the counters and like all that stuff. We didn't really start seeing that kind of stuff from Samus until like Other M, and I don't know if that was like part of Samus as a character, like in terms of Nintendo's like, I don't know, creative thinking of behind the franchise. I don't know how to put it, but like, I guess what I'm saying is, yeah, like
You're asking if that was the influence of Nintendo, if it was the influence of Team Ninja, who made Other M.
I'm saying that, like, yeah, I mean, I definitely think that stuff like the counters and all that stuff that we're seeing in Dread Samus Returns, like that stuff feels like it came from Other M, or not like came from Other M, but like that's the first time we definitely saw Samus like be that kind of acrobatic and aggressive and offensive in that kind of way. Like she wasn't doing any of that kind of stuff in the other Metroids previous to that. So I'm not sure if like around 2006, 2007, if anyone was thinking of Samus in that kind of way until I guess Team Ninja did it.
That's fair. Well, let's talk about touchscreen now that we finished up with items and stuff like that. Because I wrote down too. I'm like, what are the things about this game that if it was released on the DS, is it almost assuredly would have had to have some kind of gimmick where you needed to touch the screen, and
Yes.
I don't know what that would have been. I imagine that this game would have 100% been one screen is the map, one screen is Samus. I feel like that is almost. I would bet everything I own that would have been how it was laid out on the DS. Like I don't think it would have been like a dual, like both screens would have been part of the action. You know what I mean? And I thought about what that gimmick could be, and I thought that maybe it was like, it could have been storm missiles. Maybe I was like, maybe you tap in order to melee counter. Like maybe, I don't know, but I think that definitely for sure would have been there. But I also think that if, let's say that the map was the touchscreen, that you definitely would have got like the markers and stuff like that. Maybe you could have, like in Zelda Phantom Hourglass, for example, you can draw on the map and like give yourself little hints to go back to, which actually would work decently well in a Metroid game if you were able to like, I don't know, make a little doodle that says like, come back here, get this missile once you get blah blah blah. That wouldn't be the absolute worst thing in the world. Generally, I hated the touchscreen controls. Actually, I have an opinion, and I don't think you guys are gonna like it, but I think that in terms of like first party Nintendo games, the DS is probably one of the worst systems for Nintendo, because like I think that you had some of the worst entries in Mario and Zelda. Metroid on the DS. Pokemon wasn't anything to write home about. And I think that it kind of ties back to the touchscreen. But yeah, I think that you would have had some kind of gimmick, and it probably wouldn't have been great. And I don't know. Marking your map was the best that I could think of. The best way to make use of the touchscreen.
Well,
Metroid Prime Pinball is on the DS,
Yeah.
and so you were objectively wrong.
You're
Wendy.
so wrong. There's so many good games on the DS, man. Like to even say
There's a lot of good games on the DS.
The best Mario
There's a lot
Kart
of
is on the
good Nintendo
DS.
games.
Diamond and Pearl on the DS. I mean,
I don't think those are very strong Pokemon
those are
games,
great
I
Pokemon
gotta
games.
say.
Anyway, yeah, I'm not entirely sold which way, like, because I think it would have been so easy for them to just be like, okay, it's gonna be just like Metroid Fusion, except you'll have the bottom screen with your map available to you at all times, be able to mark the map like that. I guess they didn't want to do just that, and that's why I'm thinking it would have been potentially a dual screen kind of game, and they still couldn't get it because I feel like that would have been so easy to do. Like, you just follow up Fusion with, okay, you put the action on the top screen, you give yourself a little more interactivity for the player on the bottom screen, and that's really it. And yeah, you could maybe mark the map. Maybe you could. I'm thinking maybe there might be like slight abilities. Maybe you could like close doors, shut off power here and there, like very small things, like try to solve puzzles with the bottom screen somehow, rather than just having it like be action on both in the gameplay on both sides. But I do think that they might have thought to do it and have it be so that way you would play and see like a larger amount of the screen on the second part of like the second part of the map, or the second part, or the second screen, the top screen. Like, that just seems like something they maybe thought to do, and that would have been a way to, I guess, show more of like an EMMI room, for example. You could have like the EMMI crawling around on the top screen and try to get to the bottom one. Like, that would have been cool, and that could have been something that maybe would have been a bit too much for the DS, but if they were able to pull it off, it would have been pretty awesome.
They bring the reserve tanks back from Super Metroid, but you have to manually drag them from the item screen into your energy tank
Yes.
slot.
Oh God, I could see that too. God.
Yes.
Ugh. You know what? You know what would have been cool. Building off your idea, Dak, is one thing that we didn't talk about is maybe there could have been some kind of version of the Omega Cannon where once you go into the Omega, or once you get the Omega Cannon, you're basically stationary, but then you have to like doodle or power up your Omega Cannon.
You have to
and fire
swipe
it at
really
the
hard
enemy.
to the right or to the left or whatever
Yeah.
for the Omega Cannon. Yeah, I was
You have to
thinking
draw
about
little
that.
circles over and over.
Yep.
Because I mean, like in Castlevania: Dawn of Sorrow, like to seal away bosses, you have to make a little doodle on the screen, which is kind of lame, but whatever. It's sort of interactive, so yeah, I could see them maybe going that route.
Yeah,
but-
you could do a lot of stuff like that. Like, you could have like special missiles that you could draw a line to where they'd hit, or you could like draw like the path that they're gonna take. Yeah, the Omega Cannon, absolutely, just like swipe really fast, and that would actually be a really fun thing, I think, to do. It'd ruin bottom screens though. It'd absolutely destroy them. But like swiping as hard as you can to get it all charged up would be sick. And they'd probably have some, like, maybe they could have like bombs be dropped that way. That's where I think there's a lot of opportunity, even though it might be a bit gimmicky and cheesy. Like, that's what the system's for, I think. I don't know.
Well, it's certainly the most gimmicky. I think the DS is even more gimmicky than the Wii.
No way. The Wii was one of the most
I
gimmicky.
think so.
The Wii was so gimmicky, man.
Well,
Yeah, the Wii was definitely
I don't
the more
think the
gimmicky.
DS was far behind.
The DS was just another screen that you could touch to. The Wii remote in and of itself was more gimmicky than the whole DS combined, I think.
You know what? I will say, just to wrap up a point here, Pokemon Black and White was pretty good, but I didn't think that Pokemon Pearl and Diamond were very good. Other than that, you have the worst Zelda games on the DS. You have Metroid Prime Hunters.
Awesome
which
game.
is not everyone's cup of tea. You have New Super Mario Bros., which is a low tier.
No,
Mario
no,
game.
no, it's not. How
And
New Super Mario Brothers
listen,
game is dope.
Like
No.
the series now sucks. The series now
original
is watered down
game-
and stale, but the original one is really
The
good.
original one is really good, and it has those awesome mini games. You got Gambling Luigi,
I'm
you
sorry,
got Casino
the
Luigi.
DS low-
and even the multiplayer.
The
is pretty fun in
multiplayer
that
was
game.
sick, and you had Super Mario 64 DS, which was an awesome version of Super Mario 64, one of the best versions. You had Mario Party
Although I will say that
DS.
playing as Wario was kind of nice. That was pretty good.
Yeah, you had so many
I'll
good.
give you
You
a
had
point
so
for
many good games. You had Mario Kart DS. You had Animal Crossing Wild World, which was an absolutely
Oh, that-
incredible game.
No, that's like the worst.
What?
Anyway, let's not get on this.
Oh
tangent.
my God.
Let's not get started down here because we'll never get out. All right, I have two more points about what could have been on the Nintendo DS. One area I'm not sure that this would have been. I think that they could have turned the biggest weakness of Metroid Dread into maybe a strength if it was on the DS, and that is music. I think that that's a fairly common critique of people, that the music of Metroid Dread was somewhat forgettable. I think that they could have. I don't know that they would have necessarily, but like we're coming in after Zero Mission and after Fusion, which while they don't have the strongest soundtracks, at least the intention was there, and like you had a little bit of a better sound processor. Like you have some awesome games on DS that have like great soundtracks. Like I mean, all the Castlevania games sound awesome. There's the overworld theme from Spirit Tracks, which is awesome. I think that they could have had an opportunity to make actually some pretty wicked music if this would have been a DS game, kind of like that like chiptune music, or not chiptune, but like you know what I mean, like the 2D style of music that still sounds like it's a 2D game but still sounds sweet. You know, Doom is probably his head is probably exploding listening to me describe music. But do you know what I'm trying to say?
You're thinking of like 8-bit style music, like Shovel Knight kind of music.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure if that's specifically the direction they'd go into. I don't think they'd do like a retro throwback soundtrack, but I do think it would sound
It
more in
been
line.
8-bit, but like it would have
Like
been.
it would have sound more in line what we heard from Fusion and Zero Mission, except the
Right.
instruments wouldn't be as compressed and grainy as they were on those tiny GBA speakers.
Right. I think it would have had an opportunity to sound a lot like Super Metroid if it was on the DS, which I think is a good thing.
Super Metroid, but with less reverb, for sure. I think undoubtedly the soundtrack would have sounded better just because theoretically at this point in time, Kenji Yamamoto and Minako Hamano would probably be working on the soundtrack, and that alone is pretty much, in my book, a guarantee for success. So, yeah.
There you go. All right, one final thing. I would love your guys' opinion because I was thinking about this, and what if this release, Metroid Dread, released as a DS game? And the timing of this actually is somewhat important here because if it was originally going to release in 2006, I was thinking that this just felt weird, and it might feel less weird if it released in 2009. But so I was thinking of the story of Metroid Dread, and let's just assume that a lot of the base story is the same. Who knows if that's actually true, but let's just assume that the end goal was always to have Samus kind of turn into a Metroid with her Metroid DNA. I don't know if that would have happened in 2006. I feel like that would have been a little bit strange considering the series is still, going hard in the Metroid Prime trilogy at the time. And to me, there's kind of like a sense of finality in doing that with Samus and turning her into that Metroid, where it's like the definitive closing of one chapter of the series and like opening up another chapter of the series. And I know that Prime and the 2D games don't necessarily have a lot to do with each other, but I don't know. It felt weird to me to have that happen before the Metroid Prime trilogy concluded. Do you guys like? Do you feel at all the same way, or is that just a me being weird thing?
Yeah, I actually agree. I don't think we would have seen the same kind of finality to it as we saw like now. I don't think we would have gotten like this is the end of the current Metroid saga that we've got with the current Dread. I think, and this might go into how it would have changed the franchise, but I think we would have kept getting some more 2D Metroids pretty quickly. I don't know if they would have, maybe even Other M might have still came out at the same time, but I don't think we would have seen like, okay, this story is this part of the story is ending, but also we're still actively telling this other part of the story. Whereas now we don't really have that same kind of issue because Metroid Prime 4 is, presumably the start of a new trilogy potentially, or at least not really like, the first trilogy already ended. That game isn't even really close to coming out right now. So it doesn't feel the same kind of thing, like same kind of way. Yeah, I definitely agree. I don't think we would have seen it in like, okay, this is the last 2D like Metroid in this like particular story that we're getting at this point. It seems like it would have been right in the middle of things, even if it came out a little later, because I don't think it would have been 2006. I think 2008 would have been a really good year. Obviously, it's like the only year around that time we didn't get, a Metroid game until, the end of Trilogy was the last one in 2009 when that came out. But like nothing came out in 2008. That would have been a perfect year for this game to drop. So, yeah, I don't think we would have had that same kind of finality to it.
Yeah, I also agree. There's a couple things to consider. One, like you guys mentioned, just the fact that we had more Metroid games coming out regularly and the series was more active. And so it would have been more likely that there would have been future entries planned. Whereas nowadays, because the series is so dormant, Sakamoto probably wanted to get that finality, that conclusion to the story that he's been telling for decades out, just in case he didn't have the opportunity to make another one. Not only because, when you're working on a series that historically doesn't sell well, you don't know if this one is going to be the one that magically breaks the trend. Thankfully, it seems like it does, but that's more a hindsight 2020 thing, not something you would know within the development process. And two, another thing we have to consider is Sakamoto is getting old now. I mean, the dude is in his 60s now, and so, you only have so much time left to tell the story you want to tell, and so he probably wanted to have that one last opportunity while he's still on this planet to be able to do that. Whereas if you do that 10 years ago or so now, he might have spaced it out a little bit more to expand the storyline, maybe go in different directions, etc.
Okay, well, I'm glad it wasn't just me, because I don't know, it just seemed weird to me to tell that version of the story, like you said, right in the thick of things. So I guess that's a good enough segue as any to just kind of transition into like what how the series would have been different, or how the series might have changed had this originally happened.
Wait, before we go ahead with that, I had one more thing, because I think I don't think we really went into this, but do we think it would have been more of like a 3D game on a 2D plane like we have kind of now, like maybe like the new Super Mario Brothers games, or do you think it would have been another 2D game like the earlier 2D Metroids and like Castlevania titles? What do you think?
I think Sakamoto would have wanted it to be like a kind of Samus Returns Dread-esque, like 2.5D game, for lack of a better word. But I think ultimately they would have compromised and went with a pixel art style just because, of those limitations. I don't think Sakamoto's vision would have been able to run well on the 2.5D mechanic.
I agree. I don't think there's any way that it would have been. Now, it would have been maybe nicer pixel art, I keep on going back to Castlevania, but there was a series of really awesome Castlevania games on the Game Boy Advance, and once they came to the DS, all those models and the backgrounds and stuff looked nicer, but it was the same general kind of idea, right? And I think that would have been
Dawn of Sorrow looks
well
good. Like if you had one that looked like Dawn of Sorrow, I think that one would be sick.
I think it would have looked like a lot like the 2D Castlevanias, like a lot. Which is a good thing, because I think all three of those games looked really awesome.
See, I agree. I feel like from a Metroid fan perspective, that's what we'd want as well, like an awesome another 2D Metroid that looks like that. But at the same time, that was around when Nintendo was releasing stuff like New Super Mario Brothers and other games that was kind of reinventing some series here and there. And I wonder if they might have gone for a 3D Metroid or 2.5D Metroid to make it feel fresh, rather than releasing, a third 2D Metroid game going into the late 2000s.
I want to say that they would have stuck to what looks good and what works, but I mean, also, if you look at it, the DS was kind of the era of Nintendo taking like GameCube games and trying to shrink them down to fit on the DS. Like, you had Zelda Wind Waker style graphics on both the Zelda games, and it just didn't look very good at all. And I would argue that Metroid Prime Hunters also suffers from that same, not to the extent that the Zelda games do, but it also has the same thing. And then even like the N64 ports, like Diddy Kong Racing was on the DS, and that also looked like it was just shrunk down. It didn't look as nice. So I want to say no, but I also don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that they would have tried to do that either.
I think the DS actually can produce some really nice visuals. I think more so the problem with it is its actual resolution. Because the resolution is so small, the picture gets really grainy. But the actual models and the processing that the DS could do at the time, I think, was really impressive. I mean, you look at some of the DS games, like upscaled nowadays, the 1080p and 4K, and they look really good. Like especially Mario 64 DS and Hunters in particular, which absolutely incredible stuff in my opinion. It's just that resolution, I think, that really hampers down a lot of that visual artistry, especially in 3D titles.
Mm-hmm. And I think that a lot of games can look good, and a lot of games do look good on DS. But it was just Nintendo had some weird choices for some of its big franchise. I mean, particularly Zelda. I just can't get those games out of my head, how ugly they are.
See, what if you were getting chased by the EMMI like over the horizon, like in Animal Crossing? You know how like the world kind of like spins back into the horizon really close on the upper screen, like the EMMI's just chasing you over with that effect. That would be kind of cool. I don't know.
I'll try anything once. All right, so I apologize. I realize I skipped over. If you guys have anything that you wanted to add before we talk about how this would have shaped the franchise here, is there anything else that we want to kind of discuss before we move on?
Yeah, I was just gonna say that if they were gonna release this game, I do think that 2008 would have been such an amazing. I mean, aside from the fact that it was a year without Metroid before, we had a few years without it after Trilogy. It came out right between Corruption and Trilogy in 2007, 2009, respectively. And from what I could tell, the Nintendo DS's like second best year fiscally for selling hardware and software units was in 2008. And I think 2009 was actually the best year for it. So like it would have been a really like one of the best times to get another Metroid game out there because Nintendo DS hardware and software was both selling extremely well around that time. We had 2 solid years of another, boon period for the DS, or like its biggest boon period with a Metroid game being released on the system. So that would have been a really solid time for the franchise, and that I guess leads into the next topic. But I feel like would have had a really positive effect having it come out around that time.
Well, okay, so I have 5 questions for you guys about how this would have shaped the series of the franchise if this game had come out on the DS, and that's one of them. But let's start off with I feel like the most important question here. So we know that in order to make this game as it kind of is on the Switch, we would have had to make some big compromises, specifically in terms of the EMMIs and that sequence, in terms of the bosses, in terms of maybe some of the level design. So I think the first question that we have to ask is this game good if it releases on the Nintendo DS?
I think it would be. I think just having another 2D Metroid, whether it's, classic 2D or 2.5D, even if it was, again, just like more Metroid Fusion with maybe some more, slightly more intricate SAX sequences in that kind of respect, it might not have had the same kind of cinematic and wow factor that we know today. But I think our expectations are also different. I think what they would have been able to pull off back then would have been pretty impressive and pretty exciting. And I think there was still a demand for more Metroid. Even if it wouldn't have been the same game, I think people still would have been hyped for it and it would have been received well. I mean, obviously, provided the game was just not outright tanked development-wise for whatever reason. But, I think it could have been pulled off, maybe not to the extent we know of the game today with a lot of compromise. But even with those compromises, I think people still would have been on board. People wanted more Metroid. The franchise was selling pretty decently, and there was a lot of other games coming out around that time. The hardware was really, selling very well, so I think people would have adopted it pretty quickly.
I think I mostly agree with you. I think that this game would have been good. Obviously, I don't think it would have been, as great as the version of Metroid Dread is that we have, but I think that it would have been solid. I do think that the compromises that you would have made with the EMMI would have been, disappointing knowing what we know now. But also maybe at the same time they could have compensated for that with some really slick level design and like kind of traps and stuff like that forced you to maybe, even though the encounters weren't going to be as random and the AI wasn't going to be as smart, maybe they could have used the level design to kind of trap you in and make it a tighter, scarier scenario than it ended up being as well. So I think that it would have been good as well. But definitely there were, a few areas that I'm glad that they did wait for the technology to get to where they wanted it to be, because I think that it would have been good, but I feel like it would have been like it would have been very similar to Zero Mission into Fusion as well.
Oh, unquestionably, I think so. I mean, pretty much every 2D Metroid game since Super Metroid has been enjoyable to some degree. Even Samus Returns, for all the criticisms I have with, is still a great game that everyone should play if they have a 3DS. And I think that would have been unquestionably same if Dread released on the DS as well. Would it have been as good as Dread on the Switch? Probably not, but I mean, it still would have been a decent title. Would it have... that's the thing, though, and this is the other big thing. Would it have the impact on the series that it's having right now on the Switch? And I also don't think so, despite how well the Nintendo DS was doing at the time, because I think the Switch appeals to a much more, for lack of a better word, hardcore demographic, although I really don't like that word, but you know what
the word you're looking for is. Like, it's not like a casual demographic that's buying a DS to play Big Brain Age. You know what I mean? Like, they're playing it to play video games.
Well, even then, like, that was a lot of the DS crowd, but even then there were also a lot of like regular core gamers that were playing the DS as well that weren't the demographic for Metroid. I feel like that demographic is there now, not just because the Switch naturally attracts them more, but also because I think that The gaming landscape has changed so much since then. We've had a revival in the indie, the Metroidvania genre, thanks to big indie titles like Hollow Knight, Ori, Insanely Twisted Planet, Shadow Complex, etc., stuff like that.
Not Shadow Complex.
Yeah, Shadow
Guacamelee. How about
Complex.
that?
Ugh. You know, actually, I want to interject here really quick, actually, and add on to your landscape has changed. I don't think it's much to do with like the. I mean, it is kind of. It's not much to do with like the games that you just mentioned, but like there used to be a time when like you would, let's even back in 2006, and you'd learn about a celebrity, and it's just like this guy likes video games, and it was such a niche thing to have, and now like. You see things nowadays where it's like people are talking about Henry Cavill and they're just like this guy likes video games, and it's like I mean at this point like liking video games is akin to saying that you like to watch basketball, right? Like it's just like everybody does. So like
Yeah.
there's so much more of a bigger audience as well for that.
And I think
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh no, it's all good. And then I also think there is kind of, that historical that kind of historical like 16 years in development thing, like, and kind of like the whole thing tied to that, like if Metroid Dread released on the Nintendo DS, like it would just be the next Metroid game. It would just be another Metroid game. But Metroid Dread releasing when it does, like obviously for us fans, like it means so much, but even for the person who's never played a Metroid game, like, just learning about that history, it makes that title feel that much more special. And if that is your first title, it makes it feel like, oh, this is the one where I'm trying out for the first time. This legendary title that took almost 2 decades to make. This is where I get to jump into the franchise. And granted, I don't think that's how most people are going to experience it. Most people, Twitter's not real life. Most people, they probably just saw the cover at Target and thought, oh, that looks interesting, I'll pick that up. That's probably what's happening. But, for that demographic that is, I think it just adds that another layer of something that you just wouldn't have on the DS. There's like, the culture has changed significantly since then.
I don't know. I feel like that's true, but it wasn't like ideal. Like no one really ever wanted to wait all this time for that next 2D Metroid to really come out. Like I think people would have rather
let me ask you
the sequel to come out.
Let me ask you question
quickly.
2 and 3. Let me ask you guys question 2 and 3 because these go hand in hand together, and I think that what may be obvious maybe isn't as obvious as we think. So my question 2 is, if Metroid Dread was a DS game, does it sell well? And then question 3 is, does that lead to more 2D Metroid games? And I think we're all under the assumption that if Metroid Dread would have come out on the DS, it would have done, it would have led to more 2D Metroid games. And I'm actually not entirely sure that that's true, because I think that we're all also under the assumption that it would have sold pretty well on the Nintendo DS because the DS was such a high-selling system. But I also actually don't know that that's true at all, because you look at the top-selling DS games, and they're exactly what you think they are: Mario, Mario Kart, Pokemon, and then like way down, in fact, at the 69th spot,
nice,
is Metroid Prime Hunters. And there's none of the 2D Castlevanias like anywhere on this list at all, which I think are a decent comparable. And in fact, there's a lot of just other games like Rhythm Haven and Mystery Dungeon and Tamagotchi and Professor Layton and stuff like Lego that are on this list. And you have such a significant drop off from like the top. So the top 10 games in this best-selling DS list are all like 10 million plus, and then like it's a very significant drop-off after that, where it's like 1 million here, 1 million there. So let's just say that Metroid Dread could have sold 1 million copies. I don't know if that would have led to like a ton of new 2D Metroid games, because at the time, like I guess what I'm saying is at the time, Zero Mission hadn't been, didn't do particularly well. I don't know how Metroid Fusion did all right, but it was kind of overshadowed by the success of Metroid Prime. And Metroid Prime is kind of where, seemed to be the hot iron, and even that on the DS didn't light the world on fire either. So I don't know if I think it would have sold well. I don't think it would have bombed, but I don't think it would have done like the numbers obviously that Metroid Dread is doing on the Switch, and I'm not sure that it would have led to more 2D games.
I completely agree. I think it would have sold good for a Metroid game, but like for I think what Nintendo wanted out of the franchise, specifically after Metroid Prime. After Metroid Prime, Nintendo wanted a game that would overtake Prime, that would capitalize. They wanted Prime to be a catalyst for the series' future, and that just never panned out for a myriad of reasons, which I think you dedicated an episode of the podcast to in the very early days. But yeah, I'm sure Dread would have done well, and who knows, maybe Dread would have been the best-selling game of the series on the DS. Like, I mean, we don't know. We don't have a time machine to go back and look at that, so who am I to say? But I don't really think there's any evidence to suggest that Dread would have outperformed any of the other games much differently regarding the trajectory the series was on at the time.
Jack, what do you think?
I don't know if you're about to ask this question or if you had kind of already alluded to it, but I agree because I think ultimately we would have gotten other M either way. I think things would have still gone the same way. Even if Dread had come out, like, it probably would have done around as good as Fusion. Maybe if it did, like, 2 times as good as Fusion, right? Which I think would have been awesome on the DS. Like, did they have plans to continue to make more of those games? Or, right, did they want to capitalize on the more, like, the larger scale Prime games, and they ended up going with Other M, which definitely felt like a larger scale and kind of just bigger game than, like, a classic 2D Metroid. Had it been executed well, could have easily changed things. But I don't think, like, unless Dread just did absolutely incredibly well, like it was like a new Super Mario Brothers level kind of game, which even like now it remains to be seen how far, Dread itself cracks into the sales for the Switch. So I don't think it's like super reasonable to say like Dread would have been like a top seller. Like, even if it was like an absolutely incredible game, just the style of the game and the audience at the time, I don't think was, like Evolve painted. I'm not really, weren't really looking for that kind of game. I think ultimately you had Dread kind of come out maybe 2007, 2008, maybe 2006, but like, does that change, Trilogy eventually coming out and then like Other M coming out? I don't necessarily think so. So yeah, I don't know if things would ultimately change too much, but I think the game would probably sell decently, would be good, but I don't think it would have been like, I wouldn't have had the same impact as Dread has had now.
Yeah, and I guess to just clarify, just so that no one gets the wrong idea, I'm not suggesting that Metroid Dread should have like been in that top echelon of DS games, but I guess what I'm saying is I think it just would have sold like any other Metroid game did at the time, which, Metroid Dread on the Switch right now is not selling like any other Metroid did ever, right? Like, it's blowing them all away. So I guess that's just the point I want to make. But yeah, I think that's the next question, the ultimate question, is if we have Metroid Dread come out, does Metroid Other M come out? And for that matter, if Metroid Dread is a DS game, do you think that we always get Metroid Prime Hunters, or do you think that maybe gets pushed back as well?
No, we still definitely get Hunters for sure, because that was
I think so too.
because as we've talked about before, the Prime series and the 2D series are kind of led by two different teams. You have the 2D series led by Sakamoto, and then you have the Prime series kind of led by Tanabe-san. And they kind of, they definitely talk to each other like behind the scenes to like talk about their ideas and what they're doing, make sure they're not like impeding on each other, for lack of a better word. Like, for the most part, they pretty much do their own things. And after the success of Metroid Prime, Nintendo, absolutely wanting to get that onto a handheld. I mean, that was their big marketing push for the DS. They bundled a demo of that game on the DS. And that was before Metroid Dread even went into production. So absolutely, without a doubt, we would have still gotten Hunters.
And good thing too, because it's an awesome game. I don't think anything changes, honestly, between, like Hunters, Corruption, Trilogy. Those all come out, I think, as planned. Like, as Duno said, they're completely separated, but also, even if they weren't like entirely separated, I don't think they would have like just changed things around in that kind of way. And having like a Metroid game come out every year was just too solid, too sweet.
Yeah. So and that brings us back to the big thing, which what both of you have touched on now, is like, do we get Other M if Metroid Dread comes out? And honestly, I think that we do.
Yeah.
Because I think that Dread comes out on the DS, regardless of if it's a good Metroid game or not, which it probably is, but it's probably not like a great, the groundbreaking Metroid game that we know it to be in a lot of ways. But I think that it comes out, I think that it probably sells as well as most other Metroid games at the time. And then they probably still want to try this different direction, and we still get Other M. The question is, does the series go dark for so long after? And I think that probably stays the same too.
It's like Terminator. Like, Judgment Day always comes, like regardless of how things could have changed. Like Other M always comes out, and Metroid
Wow,
always
that is
dies.
apropos. Wow.
Regardless of how it goes down, man.
Other M always comes. All right. No matter what
It
timeline
always
you're
happens.
in. Yeah.
So, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Well, I mean, I was just gonna say this is like, so it comes out, on the DS. Other M still comes out eventually, anyways. I think that the series still goes dark, and then what are we left with after? Right? Like Metroid Dread was kind of this great big hope for Metroid fans in 2021, and maybe it's just Metroid 6 that comes out in 2021 instead. But and it's like the first chapter of a new 2D Metroid saga. I guess that could have been totally plausible too. But
We have the Retro Studios janitorial hires to look forward to.
yeah, that's right. Yeah, Other M always comes. That's right. What do you think, Doom?
So again, I'm 50-50 on this. I think you could coin flip it. I think regardless we would get some form of Other M. I'm just not sure if it would be the same game that we got, for a lack of better word. Because I think the big thing that led to like why Other M felt so unique, different, for better or worse, is because you had the collaboration with both Sakamoto and Team Ninja, as well as Sakamoto's specific desire for a more personal, grounded, well, I don't want to say grounded, a more personal story with Samus and a more cinematic approach to Metroid that he hadn't done before, as well as the desire to make a 3D action game that controlled as simply as an NES title. And I think those two combinations together is what led to Other M as we know it. And I'm not sure if that would have happened in an alternate future had Sakamoto not met with Team Ninja to have that vision in the first place, if that makes sense. And the big reason why that happened is because his team was disassembled at that time. I can't remember the exact name of the internal Nintendo team. It's like, there's Nintendo EAD and R&D1, etc., etc. It was one of those teams that worked on pretty much all the 2D Metroids with Sakamoto. And they were disassembled, and that's why ever since then Sakamoto has been looking at a third-party support for the Metroid titles moving forward since then. And had in a future where Metroid Dread comes out and does moderately well, I'm not sure if that team would have been disassembled, since there would still be active titles in development.
I think that Other M, the game, was always going to happen. I think what you just laid out, Sakamoto wanted to make that kind of game, and I think that was always going to happen. The only question I have is I wonder if the story is what it's going to be, because I feel like Other M was the intended payoff for the Federation conspiracy storyline, and obviously that missed the mark. But I wonder if Metroid Dread comes out, if we assume that it has relatively the same story as Metroid Dread that we know of right now, I wonder if they just create like a new story or a new setting or a new something, right? Like I wonder if they just don't do the Federation Bottleship Adam Malkovich deal, and that's the thing actually. I wonder if they didn't do that, is if Other M is still, I guess, as reviled as it is. So maybe that's actually the biggest thought experiment that comes out of what happens if Metroid Dread releases on the Nintendo DS. Because I think that the conclusion that we've got to is that if Metroid Dread released on the Nintendo DS, it's probably a pretty good Metroid game. It probably sells about as well as most other Metroid games. It probably leads to Other M happening in one shape or form, at least Other M the game. But maybe the game, or maybe the story could have been different in Other M if Sakamoto would have felt like maybe he wrapped up that Galactic Federation storyline in Metroid Dread. Who knows?
The gameplay would have been very different, at least. I think we can all agree on that. Assuming that Team Ninja was not involved in that, it was still internally developed at Nintendo.
I think Team Ninja was always going to be there. I think the gameplay would be the same. I think the story might be different, but that's just me. Possible that it's not. But yeah, I think we're at the end of our thought experiment here, gentlemen. Is there any other thoughts that we have that we want to put a bow on for how this game might have looked and shaped the future of this franchise if it was a Nintendo DS game?
I just want to say that if it came out on the DS, I don't know why, I think Ridley would have been in it. I think if we had him back, it was peak Ridley hours back then. Ridley was showing up. He showed up twice in Brawl. Like, he was showing up in Metroid. He showed up twice in Corruption. I guess he didn't show up in Hunters, but he should have also been in that. I don't know. I think maybe we would have gotten some... I'm still surprised we didn't get Ridley in this Dread either. I really thought we were getting another Ridley robot. Like, I wasn't convinced, but I was like, it would fit. It would work so well, and they didn't do it. So I wonder if maybe in another timeline they would have done it then. So who knows?
Well, we could talk about that in a few weeks on our Metroid Dread's biggest missed opportunities episode, because I was pretty convinced that we were going to get Ridley EMMI in Metroid Dread, and that obviously didn't.
What were they building, man? Well, in the background of that EMMI room, what was that? It didn't end up being nothing.
They were building the thermal heat cell things that power the planet ZDR. Maybe.
What does ZDR even stand for?
That's on a need to know basis, and all of us don't need to know. I guess I don't know. We're gonna get out of here though. We're going a little bit long, but I had a fun time with this thought experiment with you guys, and I can't wait to hear what all of our listeners think about what could have been for Metroid Dread had it released back in the late 2000s. We want to encourage you guys to check us out over on Twitter at Omega Metroid Pod, at Spiteri316, at DaxCity_, and at Doomwindle Cross. And of course, check us out over on Podbean, iTunes, wherever you get your podcasts. You know the drill. Like and subscribe. Recommend us to that Metroid fan in your life. And we will see you guys here next week with some exciting episode 100 details. Until then, everybody, take care.